Okay, so this part is going to tie up a few loose threads that have been running through the series, and part 14 in particular. There's going to be 3 different stages to this presentation. The first is I'm going to tie together the dialectic, the hidden dialectic of poetry, and we're going to articulate how it unfolds. That's the first part. The second part is we're going to show why this dialectic needs to be grounded in life or spirit, because the poet and poetry is, if you recall from part 14, is light returning to life. So we're going to show why the whole dialectic of poetry needs to be grounded in life. And then we're going to show the 2 main obstructions to this unfoldment, to this development of this dialectic. So those are the 3 different stages that we're going to work through. I've endeavoured to be as precise as I can with the kinds of philosophical terms that I use here. That's why I'm using, for instance, even in this title, the term dialectic, which I'm taking from Hegel, because that very much captures the kind of the way in which each of these stages sublates the one beneath it, which is another way of saying that it negates it while at the same time preserving it and transcending it. And there's going to be a few more philosophical terms that I'm going to weave into this presentation, particularly towards the end. But I've also tried to keep it as straightforward as I can, because I don't want any unnecessary clutter, and the point is to facilitate understanding, not to intimidate, and which would thwart my purpose. So let's get into the first slide. So as I said, there's going to be the next couple of slides are going to start to bring this dialectic together. But we need to do a bit of work before we can get there. So each of these stages, we're going to start with the methodology. Forget the phenomenology column. Just going to start with the methodology. Each of these stages has a method, an overarching method, let's say. There are all kinds of different poetic methods and modes within each stage and within each overall methodology. But they each come back to this methodology. They each are ultimately grounded in it. So, as a sentimental stage, methodology is sincerity. That's primarily what it's all about. This is something that is going to be completely altered in the next stage, which is slanted methodology. So the scholarly stage, we get slanted poetry. This is taken from Emily Dickinson's line about how we need to tell all the truth but tell it slant. I've had poetry mentors in the past very much emphasize the need for poetry to be slanted. Wallace Stevens also talks about how we as poets should never use the names. In other words, don't be explicit. We have to be implicit in our poetry. There are loads of different modes within the scholarly stage, but they are all ultimately grounded in that slanting, where we get a shift away from the sincerity of the sentimental stage. Then at the sensing stage, we have what I've already referred to in this series elsewhere as the sacramental methodology. How can we bring something through, something more transcendent, into an immanent form to be consumed by the other? And then at the synthesis, and beyond that, at the scrying stage, we have synthesis, which is an ability to weave many different parts into one whole. And that's I think, a deeper, more encompassing thing than sacramental. In other words, it's not meant to be consumed in one sitting. In a way that sensing poetry, sacramental poetry, is. So this methodology is going to marry right up to our phenomenology of reception, so how we receive it. We receive sincere poetry as being didactic, for good or bad. A lot of people actually prefer this kind of poetry because it makes sense, it has a point, it's direct, it's maybe not beating around the bush, it's not fluff, it's not inscrutable, it's accessible. Then at the scholarly stage, we receive slanted poetry as distance, which also maps onto the fact that the scholar at this stage is at the taste level. And taste, literally taste, the sense of taste, is removed from, well, the skin and the body, which is accessible to everything. It's higher up and above and removed. And that is what we receive scholarly poetry as distant from us. Sacramental poetry we receive as being deep, we relate to the depths, and it's the same for the scrying stage. So what I want to just double click on here is the, as you can see, I've got these red arrows here. The scholarly methodology of writing slanted poetry originates from a double confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is just when you perceive lots of different bits of data and information as confirming your already held beliefs, even if that's not actually what they're doing. It's a confirmation bias that comes from above and below its method, which is another way of saying that scholars write slanted poetry that we receive as distant, as having a distance, because it is, on the one hand, it looks down on didactic poetry as being cruder or being less complex or sophisticated. And so it looks at didactic poetry and poetry it considers didactic, and it thinks, well, I'm not going to write like that, so I'm going to slant what I write. But that alone would be enough to account for it, but then we have another one that's also really strengthening this preference for this methodology. I wouldn't even call it a preference so much as the definition or like a defining feature of the scholarly poet and stage. And that is that they look at depth, but being as yet unable to relate to depth, all they see is the form of these higher stages. And because they don't have the understanding of the essence and the vision, the spirit behind the form, what they do is they basically turn the form into something of an algorithm, right? And then a template, a formula. And that formula, without any essence, it comes across as slanted. Now, it's important to state this quite clearly. Sacramental poetry looks slanted when it isn't understood, either because the poet hasn't captured it well or the reader doesn't yet have the sensitivity to pick it up. It's not slanted. It's actually, instead of like this, it's actually meant to be a direct channel. But if you don't have that understanding, and you can pick up what the sensing poet is trying to communicate, it looks slanted. It looks like it is ambiguous. And so they take that formula and they use it in their own work. And so it's a confirmation bias, so that what they see above them in development, they perceive as confirming what they think is the right way to write poetry. So they do that above and below them. And then we also have the bandwagon bias as well. The fact that everyone else is writing this and everyone else is celebrating this in the poetry establishment is what accounts for the fact that we have a bit of a deadlock. I was going to say chokehold. That's maybe a more visceral term of the kind of poetry that's being written these days. Slanted poetry. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to mention. Okay, so just before getting into this part, which is now where we're going to start drawing these threads together over this slide and the next one, I just want to talk about how the sensing poet is doing didactic poetry, but at a higher turn of the spiral, which is another way of saying that it looks like, well, the didactic poet at the sentimental stage is writing something that is smaller than they are. They know exactly what it is because they're above it. They're bigger than it. It's this emotion that I'm going to express. And that's what it comes across as. Whereas the sensing poet knows exactly what they're going to express, but it's larger than them. And so there's two kinds of didacticism that we need to be able to distinguish and tell apart. Okay, so with this slide, I'm going to talk about how form and light and the relation to them are basically the same thing, because each of these stages is has a particular focus. So this is just another way of saying that what their methodology is, but I'm going to try and actually visualize it for you. So what we have, it's easiest to start with the sensing stage, as you'll see. The sensing stage, we've got the essence that's captured, the thing that's larger than the poet, which naturally has the form, as I've got on this slide, of a cube, let's say. So it manifests that shape. This is actually drawing a bit on Coleridge's distinction of organic versus artificial composition. Organic being something organically manifests a shape rather than artificially imposing a particular form on it. But that is what the sentimental poet, who is just focusing on the segmentary emotions, they're only going to focus on a few different pieces of this. They're going to focus on, in other words, here, I'll show it this way. Let's start with the distinction between the sensing and the scholar before we get to the sentimental. So we have, at the sensing stage, the essence that organically manifests a cube-like form. Let's just say, call it a cube. This is misunderstood, as we spoke about in the previous slide, by the scholar who can't see the essence. So it just is going to look like the form, the cube. And that's what we should write our poems as. We should write cubes. And then this, but they miss what's in the middle of it. They miss the thing that generated that form. Likewise, the sentimental poet is going to focus on the sharp outlines of that in a way. They're only going to focus on like the bits that really, stood out to them, that touched them, because that's their sense and mode of engagement. And then in the final one, I don't know if you can quite see it because my face might be covering it. It's just the sensing cube with the glow on the inside, with arrows pointing out, which is just meant to signal that the essence that's come through is also understood in its context, which is sight. So I've got two columns here, how each stage relates to form and how each stage relates to light. But they are basically the same thing. They're just different words for the same thing. If you recall in our previous video, we introduced the notion that each poem is effectively light returning to life through love. Love is what draws us into growing into more light and therefore into more life. I'm not going to explain all of that again. I will touch on it again at the end of this presentation. But if those are unfamiliar to you, I would recommend you go back and listen to part 14 because it is necessary groundwork for this. So what we can basically call a poet and poems is lighted forms. Naturally, people have a tendency to actually, I suppose, tear these apart, just focus on the form or just focus on the light, the underlying sort of, I suppose, meaning. What we want to do is we kind of want to bring them together, which is what we're going to do in the next slide. But for now, let's just look at the form. So the didactic poetry flattens form because the meaning that's trying to come across is quite crude, right? The form, and by form I'm talking about language, medium of expression, the different kinds of poetic forms that are used, rhyme, meter, all of that stuff. This is fetishized at the next stage. It's turned into an idol. An idol is something that attracts attention for its own sake rather than being sacramental and leading someone into a relation to what it represents, which is what an icon is, right? So that is effectively a snake eating its own tail when you fetishize form, which is what scholars do because they don't have the depth. So they detail their cube and make it a very, very detailed, geometrically perfect cube. And then they're proud of that because they think that's what poetry is, fundamentally. And they have that illusion of depth, but it's actually 2D. So, which is also, then this is the point, right? As I'm explaining how they relate to form, it is actually, weirdly enough, an explanation of their relation to light as well. Because it's clear that if it's just a 2D replication of what the censor and the scryer are doing, that it is effectively a silhouette. And what's more removed from a silhouette, if you imagine a silhouette, it has a clear light behind it, right? And the light is probably quite clear, it's quite bright, in order to provide a really crisp silhouette, which means it's actually moving closer to the source of light, as it were, into a more conscious relationship with it, which is what the next two stages have. But before we get there, the shade is what happens if the light is further away. The silhouette is less distinct. It's kind of just like one kind of mass, and maybe there might be some broad outlines of a shape, and that is what the sentimental poet does, because it's more crude, and so it's not capturing as much of the light. And then splendor is, and I've chosen that word precisely because that's it brings to mind William Wordsworth's poem about the believe it's his Ode on Immortality. He talks about the splendor that was lost from his childhood, or childhood in general. And I take that to mean that there was an essence that he believes he was connected to in his childhood. And that's when we actually get a beam of light coming through. That's what the sensing poet is capturing. And then that is a suffusion at the last stage, which is when it's like, when you read Shakespeare, it's like a field of light. It's not just one beam. And so really, the way they relate to form is also the way they relate to light, because to the extent that they, like, the more sophisticated their form becomes, the more sophisticated their relationship to light becomes, and vice versa. It's one development. I understand that. I mean, if I could explain this in a clearer way, I would. As it is, I mean, if I can think of, let's put it this way, if I can think of a clearer way of explaining everything I've just explained, and I can do so either in a postscript or in another video, I will. But more or less, what it boils down to is going to be distilled on the next slide. So let's get into that. What we have is, effectively, it's one development across these stages. It's one dialectic that we are unfolding, and we're articulating how they all hinge into each other. We have the seed, first of all. That's the shade, right? Growing into the stem, which is like the silhouette. It hasn't yet flowered yet. It hasn't yet spread out its foliage, which is what the what happens at the sensing stage, which also literally creates life. Like, this metaphor is how light and form interact to grow something. So the light actually grows the plant, as you can see in this video. For form and light, actually, they're one growing movement of fruition. And that ties into everything we've been speaking about fruition as well in part 13, and how that is what the final kind of imagination is, moving up from fancy to fusing to fidelity to fruition. And then finally we have the silver, which is again harkening back to another video, where it's not just one plant that grows. It's like it's turned into a jungle, a forest, a kind of, well, an Eden, which is the quote. So this is what came to mind immediately was Milton's poem, where he talks about how nature, this is when he's talking about Eden, here, wantoned as in her prime, and played at will her virgin fancies, pouring forth more sweet, wild above rule or art, enormous bliss. Which is fantastic poetry. Wild above rule or art, that captures it. What he's trying to say is wild above the rule or art, that the kind of formulas and templates that the scholar is talking about. It's just it's where they're talking about kind of these, they're coming up with these constructs, not the actual profusion of light and life itself, which isn't, it's simultaneously, it's a paradox. It's not at all civilized, and yet it is actually the thing which is more civilized than all of the constructs and templates. So let me see if I can explain this one more time. What I'm trying to get at here is the hidden dialectic of poetry. We start from a seed. It's just me bringing together, and what I'm doing is I'm fusing on the previous slide we talked about the relation of form, the relation to light, in all of these different stages, which are just two facets of the same thing. I'm trying to put it here together as one thing. We start as a seed, we grow into a stem, and think of a stem, it has that kind of superiority over the seed, and it has that bearing and that posture, which we could consider pretentious, but it hasn't yet flowered, so it hasn't yet embodied enough of the light. It's both like the light is both growing it, but it's also the light coming into and realizing itself as the plant, which is what happens more fully when it spreads and opens up and it flowers. That flowering is both the light itself flowering and the form flowering. And so it is one thing. It's the development of lighted form, you could call it, as it is growing towards life. And why have we brought in Milton's poem? Because when we read Shakespeare and Blake and Dante and Goethe, those are the four that I think of, we aren't just seeing a one flower, we're seeing a flowering of almost like nature herself. And this does link into the whole notion, as we're going to get on the next slide, and we're going to start unpacking the implications of all this. This is turning the matter of this world into Eden again. There's very deep theological implications, spiritual implications of what we're talking about here. And that is that's what happens when in the poet, that's what happens in the poem. They're both lighted forms. And then that was also going to naturally impact the culture around it, which is what I go into in the next slide, but I'll talk about it here because it's coming up now. The poet is sort of the forerunner, and the culture recapitulates what the poet has already done or gone through. And then the masses recapitulate what the culture goes through. And so that's the way in which it is a precursor or a sign, a prophetic sign of, it's not just that, because it's not a sign, it's both a sign of what is to come. This kind of ultimate fruition that we see in these well-known poets, Blake and Goethe, etc. And it is also the medium by which that flowering and, I don't know, this forest, the growing of this forest is affected. So it's the means by which it occurs, because it's one of the ways in which light itself is kind of distributed. And how do I explain this in a visual metaphor or image? It's like I suppose the immediate analogy is just that plants, when they grow beside each other, trees, when they grow beside each other, are going to be able to provide each other with as they become more, as the light and the lighted form together flowers, it becomes richer in the kind of nutrition and support that it can offer and siphon off into other growing seeds and stems and flowers and trees. And so it's both the sign of what is to come, and it is also the means by which we turn our culture and our masses into the kind of Edenic, truly civilized life that we are not just growing towards, but meant to grow towards. And that is what we're going to so we're going to unpack all of that, everything that we just spoke about. We're going to start to put into some language that is we're going to start drawing on language that's appropriate. So some theological concepts, religious concepts, philosophical concepts. So let's do that. Okay, so the logic. And I am taking this term, the logic, from Hegel, as it's a bit of a kind of a homage, because he does lay out his logic. His encyclopedia of logic is effectively making the same argument that I'm making and I'm going to make here. He's talking about how spirit, life, as we have talked about it, goes out as light and then returns to itself with a greater fullness. And he charts out that logic in a lot of systemic detail. But that is basically what we're talking about here as well. So poetry is thus a lighted form that becomes more complex as it increasingly realizes life. Alright, forgive the paragraph, I'm going to break it down for you. This realization of life is the point of poetry, the telos, without which it makes no sense. So we need to ground our whole conception of poetics, in this light-life ontology and teleology. If we don't do that, then there's no point, and that's what I'm going to actually talk about in the next, at the end of this slide. So I'm going to come back to why that is really so important. Basically, it just has to do with the fact that otherwise we get stuck in materialistic poetics or spiritualistic poetics, which turn poetry into this performative exercise, basically. And that doesn't actually... That'll do for now. If we do ground our whole conception of poetics in life or spirit, or as we spoke about in my previous video in part 14, in genius, the genius of the field. So genius, spirit, life, they all mean the same thing in the framework that we're building. Spirit, life, genius. Geist, if you want to use a Hegelian term. So when that spirit moves out of itself into light, because life is basically just the impulse that creates light. Because it has to be some kind of impulse. The prima mobile, as we spoke about it in the previous video, part 14. But then when it returns to itself, when light returns to life, when spirit returns to itself with this kind of perfect knowledge of what it is, then, as Hegel spoke about it in the philosophy of religion, then there's a reconciliation that happens between light and spirit. He didn't quite use the term light. He used variations on the term Geist, but that's basically what he means. So there's a reconciliation that happens, in which a religio is affected. Religio, from which we get the word religion, etymologically means to bind back. So light becomes binded back to life, and which is another way of saying that the poet, who is the lighted form, becomes bound back to life in such a way that a metanoia occurs. Metanoia means a conversion, and I suspect that that is a term that has perhaps been, it's been interpreted in many different ways, some more fruitful than others, and that's a pun, because we are talking about fruition, metanoia as fruition. And so what happens is when light gets bound back to life, it is no longer two things. It's no longer the questing soul trying to go into life and life. It's not these distinctions, these two poles. It becomes one whole, and then it can look out again, not as an individual soul, something that is separated from the life, but as life. And so then what is happening there is, here's another theological concept, at one-ment. It is at one, right? Atonement means to be at one. It's made one. And so life is seamlessly incarnated. This also corresponds to the final stage of the alchemical process, as we've spoken about in an earlier video. I suspect there are more implications to that piece, but for the purposes of this video, that's effectively what's happening there. Which is another way of saying we can go into it in more depth, but basically there is that at the final stage of the alchemical process, there's a coagulation, which just means a balancing of opposites, and there is a kind of balancing of light and life that happens here. And so I've said the questing soul has arrived at perfect knowledge of the Godhead which it knows itself as. It has arrived again in the Edenic silver which it has itself created. Okay, so we've got quite a few different things going on here, and it does match onto alchemy, because the alchemists, when they were working with the stone, it was the thing that is trying to create the stone is also the part is in the stone as the thing that is trying to work upwards towards the thing that's creating it. There's a way in which the whole thing is life going, or spirit going out of itself into something else in order to return to itself as one thing. And it was ultimately the whole time one thing, only it had to, in a sense, forget that. And that is what Hegel writes about as well. Okay, so this is the point that we made on a previous slide. So no new information here, really. Just that you have the poet, which is recapitulated in the culture, which is recapitulated in the masses. And so I will say that whole process of the spirit going outside of itself into something else in order to return to itself with full knowledge and become one again, the one that it always was, is synthesis. That's what synthesis is. Synthesis isn't isn't conformity. So it's not just as some theosophical writers have spoken about this. Like, synthesis is basically where something can be one and the many at the same time. It's not one that everything is kind of forced into, which would be something like unification. So it's more synthesis. Okay. And the final point in the logic is that when we tear this ontology apart, we only focus on one pole of the light-life ontology, which is what happens naturally. It's not their fault. People just don't see it. That hasn't really been clearly articulated like this, I think. And people don't understand that everything is grounded in this, in the life and genius of the field of poetry. And so what happens is we get people, if they focus on the in a way the light part of it, the form part of it, what happens is, I mean, they wouldn't conceptualize what they're doing as light, but that's effectively, in our language, what they're doing. They're only seeing themselves as light with no connection to spirit. So they focus on form a lot. The problem is that this creates, as we spoke about in part 14, the isolated intellectual. We spoke about it in part 13 as well. Definitely part 13, maybe part 14, where they are really intelligent and they come up, but they're isolated. They're not in conversation with the actual life of the field, and so they're coming up with these constructs rather than growing in, like, with the life of the field, like growing this lighted form that can unfold. It's like a impasse, basically, where it populates things on a kind of horizontal level. They come up with constructs that don't have that much connection with the real living spirit of the field. I'm going to explain this more on the next slide. I'm going to give you a visualization of this. And then you get the other pole, spiritualists, people who prioritize spirit over form, and so they don't actually incarnate. And so what happens is they become effectively, this is where we get, there's a few different reasons for spiritualist poetics and why it fails. Ultimately, it's because then it isn't grounded in the lighted form. It drifts into a kind of what is effectively it's effectively in effect. The effect it has is that it's sentiment, which is like, if we remember the legacy of each of these stages, the sentimental legacy is to splash, because the natural element is the sea. It splashes us, and it doesn't actually have the deeper subtilizing and seeding effects that the sensing and the scrying stages have, which is what that ties into the growth and the natural images that we've been making here. So let's explain this visually. So here we have my attempt at visualizing what I'm talking about, in visualizing the materialist spiritualist impasse. So I thought about including a more specific breakdown of the ways that the unfolding of this dialectic can get obstructed. But we've already done quite a lot in this presentation, so I think it's fair to you and to me if we leave that to another video. It may only be brief, but at least we can then sort of do it justice and do it properly and take our time with it. So what we'll do now is just touch on, we'll get the main sort of idea, and then we can get into, we can break it down further if we need to in a future video. So from part 13, you'll remember this continuum of the associative fancy, the intelligent fusing imagination. We didn't talk about the spiritualist, the cooperative kind of fidelis imagination, which has fidelity to essence, and is able to start to cooperate like the vigneron with the vineyard, with the genius of the field, and a co-creator with the fruiting imagination, who is able to ultimately connect, understand, not just cooperate, but understand the genius of the field. So as you can see, I've got a little arrow saying that Kant, who spoke about how we couldn't really connect to the world around us, I do need to read more Kant to break that down more specifically, but I do know that he, was one of a few different people who was trying to think of a way to show how we could be connected with, how we can be connected to reality beyond ourselves, and that, but he, as I understand it, my sense of it is that he struggled to do that. And as a result, then we get, of course, the Descartes and Hume and those kinds of philosophers and Locke, who's very much the associative level, but a scholar as well. But he thought that association, mechanical thinking, is sort of the best we can do. And we know that Blake, I don't know if you know, but Blake was very much, a lot of his ideas were, I want to say, created in opposition to Locke. I mean, I don't want to say that Locke was what generated those ideas in Blake, but they certainly helped to clarify them for him. What I'm trying to get at here is that on the left-hand side of this slide is where most people are. Most poets are, most philosophers are, because they don't yet have a relationship to reality, more or less. In the sense that I'm talking about, in the sense that they don't know how to commune with it, participate with it in their thinking and in their art and creating. So, what happens at the spiritualist? So, by the way, the left-hand side is typically where you get the materialist poets who obstruct that unfolding. Because a lot of people have that limitation that I just spoke about. So what is it that happens at the spiritualist level? How does that obstruct this unfoldment? Well, here is what I'm going to do, is I'm going to try and draw out a bit of a, this is just how it occurred to me to visualize it. The associative level, we've got a monkey who's still on the ground. They haven't yet tried to stand up, let's say. Then we have at the next level, the scholars of the world, even intelligent scholars like Kant and Coleridge, who are trying to move into something that's more cooperative. They tend to be basically crouching. So they're starting to try to balance sort of on their haunches. Then we get the spiritualist, who is trying to move beyond the confines of the in the Descartian sense of the ego as being just this thing that's not connected to reality, they're trying to move beyond that scholarly confine, and they're wanting to effectively unfold further with light, to grow as a lighted form towards life. But they don't have that vocabulary, and I suppose they don't have that organization, let's say. So what happens is they're not fully sure, they don't really know where the rope is, right? So they're standing up almost to try and grab the rope, and what happens is they fall down because of it, because they don't know where the rope is, and so they try to grab something that ends up being kind of a bit like air, and they fall down without realizing it necessarily, and they slide back down to producing something which is effectively, like as I said, in effect, sentiment that produces a splash rather than subtilizing us to the life of the field or seeding the life of the field in the field, right? So that's what I think more or less happens. Now, we can chart out different kinds of spiritualist poets. We've got some who are just at the sentimental stage, and they just like some of the ideas. It makes them feel good, so they talk about it that way. That's sort of your New Ages. But then you get what I would call the proper spiritualists, who are actually doing what I said, trying to move out of the scholarly stage, which is someone like Steiner. I haven't read enough of Sri Aurobindo. I will say that some of his poems seem analogous to that, but again, I haven't read enough of his, and he has a lot of other really good ideas, so I'm inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt. At any rate, we can sort of break down this a bit more specifically, and we may do that in a future video. So, what we have beyond this is the censor, who is able to actually actively grasp the essence and the life of the field. And then I've just tried to show the final stage as a monkey actually learning to effectively swing between the ropes. It is I suppose, a bit of an amusing analogy or sequence of images, but it's the one that wanted to come out. I think it's the sort of the most straightforward way I could think of visualizing it. So what we need is to basically break beyond this impasse so that we can grow as a field and as poets, individual poets. To do that, to get beyond fancy, to get beyond the kind of fusing imagination to the fruiting imagination we've been speaking about, we need, I think, ultimately, the next step is to learn how to inhabit an imagination and a poetics of fidelity to essence, to grab the rope, so that the lighted form of our poetry can unfold with the genius of the field, and ultimately become that, which is what the culmination of the process is. So, just to reiterate, without life, spirit, genius, Geist, in the bigger picture that we have, we get stuck where Kant and Coleridge got stuck, with the picture of a genius who's intelligent enough to come up with ideas out of the bowels of his own mind, or constructs we should call them, not in connection to anything real or living. So we need we grow with, when we connect to essence and we write a poem from essence, that is the same thing as light reaching the plant and then coming to fruition in the growth of the plant, just like the form of the plant itself is also coming to fruition. So we need to participate with light to grow with it in our forms and as light, in order to ultimately come to realize life, of the life of the field itself, and what it's intending to do. And then ultimately we can come to even understand that, and understand what is, what the life of the field intends and plans. That's at the co-creating stage where we come to actually understand it. That's the terrorist, who is able to see the what the whole vineyard across many seasons is trying to express, is expressing, that the broader tapestry, if you like, and the purpose of it. So in other words, we need to live into life, and that's what it means to have a spiritual poetics. Not a spiritualist, but a spiritual poetics is one that is completed, where we are not just creating out of an isolated sort of ego, but we're creating in this kind of cooperation with the light that's coming in order to grow towards into becoming essentially the genius of the field, into growing that silver in our poem, but also in our culture and as a society. If we don't have that, if we focus only on, there's a way in which we need spirit. If we just focus on, so let me just, this is just, I'm trying to get this thought out and we'll see where it goes. If we just create, if we even have, except in light, and we said we need to participate with essence, but we don't ground that in spirit, what is it that grounding everything in spirit does? I think it's that it gives us the rationale for participating in the unfoldment of light. Otherwise, we perhaps can become too self-referential in our poetics. We do it for ourselves, which ultimately inhibits the unfoldment of light, and inhibits our ability to flow with, to map our intelligence onto essence. And that is, as I said in part 13, what we're trying to do here. If we just have our intelligence, and it's meant to, out of itself, like a spider, out of the bowels of itself, come up with these constructs, which is what philosophers like Deleuze and Guattari, I believe, spoke about. If I'm correct in my memory and interpretation, that we should just come up with these constructs, irrespective of reality. That seems to be the quintessential scholarly move that I'm talking about. If we just do that, then we're not using the vitality of our mind, to use that Coleridgean term. The vitality of our mind is meant to map onto the vitality of nature. And if we still have somehow in our vocabulary or worldview that we are going to map onto the vitality of nature so that we can look good, it's going to ultimately limit the unfoldment of that plant as well in what we might call, as we've got the materialist obstruction, we've got the spiritualist obstruction. We might call an egoic obstruction, perhaps, personal obstruction. Whereas what we're ultimately coming to participate in and unfold, just like a plant unfolds, is not for the sake of our personality, but for the sake of the life that we really are, in the sense that we spoke about a couple of slides back. And even that move, the life that we really are, can still put too much of an emphasis on us. It's more that we do it for life, such that life realizes itself through us. And that is a more encompassing and accommodating conception of poetics that I would call a properly spiritual poetics. And that's what we need to ultimately be able to learn to live into in order to not obstruct the unfoldment of this hidden dialectic. Actually, I think I've got a bit of a way of explaining it even more clearly. We need spirit in the picture, or life, because otherwise we get cramped and we don't unfold. The whole point is to unfold like the flower and the forest that we are and can be. And basically the three different ways we spoke about getting obstructed, obstructed with this materialist encasing, where we go, no, there's no light or essence to connect to, so we can't unfold in that way. That keeps people cramped. That keeps poetry as a field and individual poets from unfolding. But similarly, the spiritualist obstruction, where poets kind of do this curious thing where they ultimately come to look at light as this thing that is really easy and close and indistinguishable from their feelings and emotions, which is why it blends into and becomes sentiment, is a obstruction too, in a weirdly opposite way, where it's like instead of saying it's impossible, it's almost saying it's too easy and accessible and close, and it's just really our positive feelings. And that's not really doing justice to, that's still a kind of cramping, because it's saying, well, spirit can only really happen here in this way that's really close and immediate, which is touch again as well. And so it keeps the spiritual poles from really actually unfolding into the real density and richness of texture, of living texture, of the lighted form that is genuinely spiritual poetry, like Shakespeare and Blake and Dante and Goethe. And then the personal obstruction is a similar thing. It's a way of saying basically the poetry that can come through can only really serve to elevate me, the ego of the poet. And that already, even in just feeling or just sensing that there's a wrongness to it, because that is, it says it's responsive to essence for itself, but it's not even. But that's an oxymoron. You can't really. It's a distortion of it, and that's not fidelity, which is the kind of imaginative ethos or praxis that the sensing stage has. It's fidelity to the light that's coming through. And so in order to do that, you actually need to not have that personal bias, so that we can ultimately unfold. So we need the spiritual, we need spirit, or life, or genius in the puzzle piece, in the worldview that we're assembling here, the picture of poetry. Because otherwise we get cramped and pulled off to a side, and we don't unfold. We don't fully unfold the whole sort of dialectic. And that wraps up this part of this video, and we'll see if we need to do any more videos, but to clarify or consolidate any of this, but otherwise, thank you for listening, and I appreciate your attention. Don't hesitate to reach out and let me know your thoughts.